My name is Lucia Specia. I'm professor of language technology and well, natural language processing, to be more specific, at Imperial College. And I've been working in this field since '98, and mostly working on the topic of machine translation, but also on a number of related topics, including how we evaluate the output of machine translation systems, and how we generate summaries, how we generate simpler texts from complex texts, and a number of related topics, but mostly machine translation.
So what would you say that been some game-changing developments in machine translation, right? So what in your view is the biggest advantage of a machine translation of literary works over a human translation, perhaps?
So machine translation is a very ancient field, if you like, which has been around since the late 50s with the development of computers. And there's been steady progress over the last many decades, from systems that were very simple, a set of like rules that were designed by linguists to translate a few dozens of different types of sentences. And as you can imagine, this would be very simple rules. Say if you find the word X in English, this is how you should translate it in, say, Russian, like a dictionary. But if you find a sequence of words X and Y, this is how you should translate them. So we know that language is very rich, and there are many ways in which you can say the same thing. There are many words, and there are 7,000 languages. So this obviously doesn't scale. But there, for a long time, this is how machine translation systems were developed, which was interesting because in principle, there was a lot more interaction between translators. So either translators or linguists who were behind the design of the rules, and then the computer scientists who were implementing them in a single model. And back then, I think this was a very transparent kind of technology. And if things went wrong, we could tell where and why they went wrong, but it wasn't scalable. You cannot think of all possible rules in which you can translate between two languages. Then in the last couple of decades, there's been a shift towards what we call statistical systems, where the approach is very different. Instead of having someone designing these rules, we actually feed a computational model a lot of examples of human translations, as many as we can find, hundreds of thousands or millions if we can find them. And then we have algorithms that try and generalize this, and if you like, to create some sort of rules, even though the rules are not readable to us as humans. They're more like a black box kind of rule set. So there was a lot of progress with one type of statistical system, which was basically learn how to build dictionaries, if you like, word for word or phrase for phrase dictionaries, and then had something on top to learn how to put this together in a sequence. But this was also not ideal because it's not how humans do it, right? Humans would read the entire input and then put that in context, and then start generating the output once they have a full picture of what the input is. And these models didn't do it because they were translating words or small sets of words and then putting them together. So in the around 2014-15, has been yet another big shift towards what we call neuro machine translation, which are models that are a lot more powerful because they're able to process longer context, and before they start generating the output, the translation, they already take into account all of the input, which we can talk about a bit more in detail, but essentially it's what makes them very different from the previous technology that we had. Now, when it comes to advantages of the systems over human translators, we can talk about general advantages of machine translation, which are essentially time and cost. So you can translate a lot faster, and it will cost a lot less if you are able to implement the technology or even use some resources on the cloud, like Google Translate, which is fairly cheap. With certain types of technology, one could also claim that there could be, depending on what you're translating, a quality advantage, and that's, I'm very careful with that word because it's very limited. It's very specific to certain types of text that you're translating, and that's mostly to do with consistency. And it's being able to ensure that if you translate a word in a certain way, if you translate it again, it will be the same way. And this is very important for some types of texts, like technical manuals, user manuals. You don't want to have different words meaning the same thing because that will confuse the user. But it's not the case for literary texts, where you may want to have diversity and so on. So I wouldn't claim that this notion of quality, which is mostly to do with consistency, is there in all of the things that we want to translate, or is needed. But for certain types of documents, it's important. And this is the case with, as I said, with some of the technology, but not everything. With these neural models that we have now, consistency is a little bit less ensured, and there are many cases where translations can go really wrong, even if the word is the same, but if it's given in a slightly different context. So when it comes to literary text, which is what I think we're mostly interested in here, if we assume that it is possible at all to use machine translation to do this kind of translation, the advantages would be time and cost. I wouldn't add quality to that at all.
In terms of the bigger picture, could you say where we are at the stage of maybe reaching that potential of even having quality in a better way?
So what these neural models do is they are able to, like I said, process the entire input, which is often modeled as a single sentence. And we know this is very limited context, but there are models that can also take, say, a full document into account as input, and even look at external knowledge source. Say you have a terminology that you want to enforce, they can do that to some extent, but they still miss a lot of more like global contextual cues, if you like. They will not be able to understand anything about the cultural context in which the input text is produced, and any implications when on the transfer of that to a target language. And that is, there is no way of entering that into a model, even though people have been thinking about, well, can we at least model some sort of common sense knowledge to prevent these models from generating completely nonsensical translations, which they do sometimes, on things that are not literal translation from the input to the output, and where they get really funny results, but not high quality at all. So even though these models are better at modeling input context, this is limited to the textual context mostly, and at most some sort of dictionary that you can input as like terminology and so on, but not to more global knowledge such as common sense or cultural knowledge and so on. But there's still huge, we can call it a gap if one believes that can be filled, but I think there's still a big discrepancy in terms of how humans would be able to take the text and understand it in the context of not only the country of the language of origin, the writer, I don't know, any additional important things in the context like religion or political views and so on, and then transfer that to a language where things can be very different. So I don't see any way in which these models could do that. They don't do that now, and I don't see that they could do that.
Seeing how or where in terms of technological perspectives we are right now, how soon or how far do you think that we can expect to get an exact translation of, say, languages or, say, poetry just by a machine with the cultural context?
So I don't think this is something that well, translating literary texts like poetry, especially poetry, is something that these models are going to achieve with sufficient quality. Now, even in literary texts, there are different types of literary texts, and there are some texts that are easier to translate than others, even for humans. So if you compare, I don't know, an essay about any topic versus poetry, there's a big gap there. And or if you compare a novel, which is sort of quite factual, not very philosophical, to poetry, again, there's a big gap. So I think this models might be able to do sort of a fairly decent job at translating easy literary text, which would be easy for humans. Say if you took a translator who's still a student but knows the languages and knows the theory of translation, the student is likely to still do a better job than the best possible neuro machine translation model that you can find. If it's an easy to translate text. Now, if it's hard to translate text like poetry, I don't think there's even, I mean, there is no comparison. I don't think it's a matter of saying 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. I think it's not what these models are designed to do. And I don't think there will be better models that can do that. It's just too creative. It's just, I mean, these models work on the basis of memorization. So that's one of their biggest abilities, to memorize not only how words are translated, but how words in context are translated. So, and by context, it could be a sentence or it could be a full document. And with things like poetry, we know that it's not a matter of memory. And even though writers might have their style, it's unlikely that you see things like repetition in poetry. And therefore, it's unlikely that these models are going to be able to memorize things. And also the way they memorize things is by seeing the things repeatedly. So if poetry, even if you're able to collect like the largest possible data set of all of the poetry in one language and their translations into another language, say English into German or German into English, it's unlikely that we'd see any repetition or like significant number of repetitions, which means these models wouldn't be able to do anything. What their role is to generalize what they see from data, and to generalize something means to learn from a lot of repetition, which is like how we humans learn to speak a language. We on the basics of a language at least, we see the same name being given to a fruit when you see the fruit, so we associate that. And if we only see that once, kids are very clever, but if we only see that once, it's less likely that we will remember. But if we see that again and again and again, and that's how adults learn language as well, by seeing the word repeatedly in context. So that's exactly what these models do. But if we want to apply them to translate poetry, they're not going to do a good job, because the concept of memorization doesn't work there. And also they have these other limitations, which are the lack of contextual awareness when it comes to everything, culture and so on, and style as well. Like, how do you transfer the style of the writer from one language to another when even word order may be very different, but not because of the language divergence, but because of the style, how you would say that in a different language. And this is not something that I predict these models will be able to ever do.
In that sense, how do you think that these machines can be then incorporated by, say, publishers or other translators to help them in their work to reduce, as you said, cost or time as well?
If we think about ways in which machine translation can help publishers and writers or translators in how they can do their job faster and at a cheaper cost, I think the most traditional model has been using machine translation as a way of producing a draft. So you get the output of a system and then you work on improving it. And this has been around for other types of texts, like technical documentation, medical text, and so on, for a while. So it is a model that is used in industry, in the translation industry, when for non-literary texts, and it's quite successful. And it's been shown that it is a lot cheaper for publisher, well, for any end user of translations, so being like a customer of translations, to have the content produced this way. Just get a quick, cheap draft and then have humans post-editing it. Now this is one model. The other model, which works for certain types of content, like user-generated content, is to just publish the machine translation output as is. But this is not possible when the quality requirements are different or for high quality. So for literary translations, again, depending on the type of text, it could work to have a good machine translation model producing an initial draft, and then having humans editing it. Now, I think this would have to be sort of tested in practice, because I think this initial draft sort of biases humans to see the content in a different way. So, and this has been shown in other areas, not literary text, but other areas. When you compare what the final translation is with and without a machine translation system in the middle, the outcome can be very different. And doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other, but what has been shown is that faced with a machine translation output, humans would tend to edit less because it's already there. It's basically guiding their brain to already take that as input and just try and fix it. And in some cases, even making or even leading to humans missing some errors that are there, but are not so obvious.
That actually answers one of the other questions I had as well about this quality estimation that you mentioned about if it can be the other way around, that is, if machine translation can overcome human scope for error. Would you like to add anything to that, or is the quality estimation thing much of what it is?
So one thing that the current models do is that they tend to generate very fluent text. It reads very well. They have a very good language model of the target language, but sometimes there is like a critical error that is not obvious. For example, if you if you invert a word that was negated into a non-negated form, or so if you say you had unhappy and it becomes happy, if you just skim through it, you might not notice that right away, because it's a small difference, it's 2 letters, but obviously it makes a complete difference in the final translation. So post-editing is a model that could work even for certain types of literary text. Again, I don't think it would be helpful with poetry, but one has to be very careful in the setup of the workflow to prevent, number one, translators from then sort of forgetting what they would do otherwise and trying to just fix what is there, but also making sure they don't miss errors. And there's technology, and I myself do a lot of research in that as well, which is aimed at spotting errors for post-editing. So we call it quality estimation, and it can be done at the word level. So essentially, it would be like a spell checker that you have like on Microsoft Word, which would highlight some words that are either clearly incorrect or potentially incorrect. We can't be very sure as in spell checking, because it's a much harder problem, such that the translator would make sure those words are looked at least. So there are ways around like trying to make sure the post-editing process works well, but it's still sort of open research to find the best possible way of integrating machine translation into workflows that are not the obvious cases of technical documentation and so on. So for literary text, there isn't a lot done in terms of research. I'm aware of one project that looked into a small project and how they could apply current machine translation technology to literary text. And they were doing that on some books, some novels. And I think their main conclusion is that it can be used as a draft for language pairs that are very close to each other. So basically where the cultural transfer or any other type of transfer wouldn't, not a huge amount of work would be necessary there, because the languages are very similar. And obviously that doesn't mean the cultures are very similar, but often it is the case that if languages are very close, say Spanish and Catalan, so it happens to be the same country, there will be some differences there. But for those cases, or Spanish and Portuguese, for those cases, they found that the technology can be used to provide a good draft to make translators more productive. There have been some studies recently as well claiming that these models have achieved human parity. They're actually a sequence of 3 studies. Again, not for literary translation, but for news in this case, news translations. And there was a sequence of one paper published by Google saying we are close to bridging the gap between human and machines. And the next year, there was a paper by Microsoft saying we achieved human parity, meaning that when they did some sort of systematic evaluation on the output of machine translation systems versus the output of humans, and they gave those 2 versions to other humans to judge the quality, the human judges preferred the machine translation output to the human translation. But now there are some caveats there in the way the experiments were conducted, and especially on who produced the human translations and who rated the 2. So this were, the raters were I wouldn't call them translators. They were mostly like volunteers just reading the text. Whereas you can think that it's plausible if it's news, because it's like the end user of news, but then there were some inconsistencies there as well. But then this was second paper. The third paper, the year after, was by Facebook, claiming that machine translation had surpassed human translation quality. And again, this was done in the context of news. And all of these papers are interesting, but number one, they come from industry and they're trying to sell the technology. And number 2, they are looking at 1 or 2 language pairs. Like one of them was, I think was English-German, the other one was English-Chinese. And number 3, they are on a very limited type of text, in this case, just news. And then 4, there may be some experimental glitches in the way they conducted, in terms of are your professional translators like really good professional translators, or are they like producing translations that are suboptimal? Are your human judges very good at what they do, and so on? So I wouldn't take them extremely seriously, but I think right now we cannot say that these models are produce fewer errors than humans, and this quality estimation is a way of flagging the errors, which could be used for human translation as well. But otherwise, yeah, I wouldn't say that machine translation models are making making fewer errors than humans.
Do you happen to have some examples of texts where machines have been remarkably successful? If in general as well, or if you have any specific examples related to literature, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything related to literature. And I think that is most likely because they haven't been really successful. And in general, I think other than the obvious repetitive text, there are things like in the legal domain, patent translation, for example, which are this they're not repetitive in a sense that they have a structure that is repetitive, but otherwise the claims in a patent can be very open, and they can include a lot of technical terms and things that would be very tricky to translate. And these models have been doing a very good job at that, and people have, I mean, industry has been using this to translate patents in production, and I think that's a good example, which is not the simple user manual kind of example. But in the literary world, I cannot recall any example of a successful case of machine translation.
So the big question, I think I'm quite clear by the way you've explained it, but I'll still ask: is it the rise of the machines? Should translators be worried, or so basically, like, what might be the financial implications of machine-based translations on the human resources in publishing industry?
Yeah, so I've been I interact with translators a lot through different means, like including, for example, the European Commission, who has a few thousand translators doing the translation of all of the proceedings and so on of the Parliament, all of the documents that have to be in all of the 27 or so European languages. And there's always been this sort of clash between technology providers, be them from industry or from research like myself, and the translators, or at least a perceived clash in the sense that the systems are going to take their jobs and so on. And I always try to reassure people that this doesn't need to be the case, and that there is a lot of different types of text to translate, and that the technology is only going to potentially replace, or at least well, not replace entirely, obviously, because you still need humans to do a check on the quality, but to change the way human translators work, and potentially the way they're paid, because that's another issue, that post-editing pays less than translation from scratch. But I think this ends the answer of whether translators should be worried about technology replacing them. It's again very dependent on the type of content to translate. So with more like niche areas like literary translation, and when I say niche, is in terms of the volume of translation. If you compare it to, say, I don't know, social media post translation, which happens to be like 2 billion posts a day or something, just in one of the platforms. So I think the answer is for certain areas of translation, certain types of documents, such as user manuals and so on, it's already happening that people have to either adapt and learn how to do post-editing and learn about technology as from a user's perspective, not as a developer, or change and start translating something else. But in literary works, I think there is a good chance that certain types of this literary works will be aided by machines, the easier types, in maybe not a very long future from now. But I wouldn't, if I were a translator now, I would be asking myself the question is like, would the type of text I translate personally, what are the chances of that being translated by a machine? And if you do a simple test, go to Google Translate, which is potentially one of the top systems, and try and translate one of the texts that you're translating now, you see that this is not the case now, but it will also give you an indication of how far this technology is from getting a good translation of what you need to translate. I would do a simple comparison. Go and translate a snippet of the text yourself, and then go and Google Translate it and look at the differences. And that will give you a good estimate of how far we are. And I think that's where we're going to be for a long time, at least, because there isn't any, I mean, all of the changes all of the limitations that we know the models have now, even though there's still work to be done to improve on those, none of them will be related to the things that I don't think can be solved, which are to do with the cultural transfer and so on. So I wouldn't be worried. I think if you work in that niche area of translation, which is poetry and very complex literary texts, I wouldn't be worried. Now, if you work on simpler types of texts, then you need to rethink of whether you want to be a post editor or an editor in general, or a proofreader, or you'd rather shift to a different area of translations.
No, but that's a very nice picture that you've painted for us. In sort of a conclusive remark, what would you ideally like to see happen in the years to come on how human translators and machine translators, or humans using machine translations, live or progress in the near future, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the humans tend to be very critical of machine translations and take this approach that either it's perfect or it's of no use, and that's not very productive, because it is a machine doing something, and we tend to be very lenient and accepting of other types of technology that are not perfect, like our automatic corrector on our text messages. It gets things wrong all the time. What do? We keep using it. We don't disable it because it gets things wrong a lot of the time. So I think this is how people should think about machine translation. It's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect. And that doesn't mean it's not useful. So one coming from the human translator's perspective, I think looking at the translation as a more like as an aid, as something that's going to help me be more productive, is something that people should think about. And then from the other side, from the developers and researchers in the field, I think we need to listen to translators a little bit more, and to try to understand what types of errors are really important and should not happen, and then trying to model these errors, like the example I mentioned before, the errors that are not extremely obvious when humans are fixing the translation output. What are these errors, and how can we try and change the technology to avoid producing those errors? And then we should really, I don't think we should be going in the direction of trying to replace the human for really creative types of text, like literary text, but rather think about how we can help that process. Because even, I mean, when we talk about volumes of translation, even for literary texts, I don't have the numbers, but I would doubt if like the offer in terms of translators is bigger than the demand. Like we need to wait, like say, even in the media industry, to get subtitles for all of the media content that's translated there, which is also creative content. It takes time, and this has huge costs for the media industry, because they don't reach certain countries up until they have to wait until the translations are produced. So I think there are many ways in which the technology and human translators can coexist in very productive ways. But as translators, one needs to be a bit more accepting of the failures of the machine. And as developers and researchers, we need to be a bit more aware of what actually makes the technology disliked the most or less useful for human translators as a tool. And when I say as a tool, it doesn't need to be for post editing. It could just be for inspiration. Like, can I find ways in which I could say this in a target language? And then you can basically just get the inspiration and change it as you go. But there are many ways in which these two things kind of coexist peacefully. And I think we'll get there in that respect. But we're still not there.